New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos. You can now download a free PDF copy or purchase a beautiful printed edition of Issue 5 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Good evening. Tonight our topic is altered states of consciousness in transpersonal psychology. And my guest, Dr. Charles Tart, is the author of numerous books, including Altered States of Consciousness and Transpersonal Psychologies, both classics, as well as many other books such as On Being Stoned and Psi, Studies of the Scientific Realm. Dr. Tart's newest book is called Waking Up and is an integration of the mystical writings of the early 20th century writer G.I. Gurdjieff with modern psychological principles. Welcome, Charlie.
Good evening, Jeffrey. I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I think for the benefit of many of our listeners, it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about who this person Gurdjieff was and why you, an academic psychologist, would be interested in his writings.
Why am I hanging out with a rogue like Gurdjieff?
Yeah.
Many people think he was a rogue. He was not your picture of a traditional mystic. He liked to make people angry. He liked wine, women, and song. He did not teach in the usual kind of holy, everyone sit and look serious kind of thing. He was a very alive sort of person. But I think he was one of the first people in our century to really bring back some of the profound psychological ideas of Eastern psychology and try to put them in a form that Westerners could make some sense of. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we're very much schooled in scientific method and machinery as the epitome of science, so he talked about man being a machine and compared the automated mechanical aspects of our habits to the functioning of a machine in order to try to get people to wake up.
Now, he died over 30 years ago, didn't he?
Oh, yes, in the late 1940s.
And yet he seems to have exerted a strong influence on many prominent people of his own day.
I've personally found the psychology inherent in his teaching a great integrating set of ideas all through my own work on altered states of consciousness. Mm-hmm. He had a broad framework that made sense out of so many different manifestations of mind.
You know, the book of Gurdjieff's that sticks in my mind, and probably many of our viewers would have seen it, is called Tales of Beelzebub, and it's almost unreadable.
It was intended to be.
Uh-huh.
That is a fascinating book that has driven many people mad. Gurdjieff wrote it testing the theory that people don't appreciate an idea unless they work hard to get it. Mm-hmm. So he first laid out his ideas, and then he wrote them in as awkward and disguised a form as possible. And then he'd read a chapter to his students. If his students seemed to be getting it, he'd rewrite it to make it even more difficult. So the book is really impossible that way. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people, of course, swear by it, thinking that theory was right. If you really work to understand something, it's worthwhile. My understanding is that Gurdjieff himself decided actually that the experiment was a failure, that making it hard didn't necessarily mean that people would understand any better.
I suppose for viewers who may not still have a handle on who we're talking about, we might mention the movie by Peter Brook, Meetings with Remarkable Men, was about the life of Gurdjieff.
Yes, and Gurdjieff himself wrote a book with the same title, mm-hmm. Meetings with Remarkable Men, that is easy and fascinating reading.
Yeah. So, you know, when you talk about him being unconventional and having some bad habits, it almost reminds me of some of the modern-day gurus we hear about, such as Rajneesh, who has gotten so much popularity. How would you distinguish between these two?
Well, the message, for one thing. Most mm-hmm. of the modern-day gurus we hear about encourage going in and developing higher states of consciousness and having transcendent experiences, which is all very fine in a way. Mm-hmm. But Gurdjieff emphasized almost the opposite end of the spectrum. He said, We don't approach this as sane, healthy beings in the first place. We're all kind of crazy, really. The social situation makes us that way. And you don't give a crazy person mystical experiences. You give a crazy person the means to start understanding themselves and become sane. So Gurdjieff was very practically oriented in his teachings.
Now, one of the things I remember the most from going through Gurdjieff's writings is the notion that we are all normally, in effect, asleep. We think we're awake, but we're not. I guess that has something to do with the title of your book.
Yes, as a matter of fact, to start the book, I have a long chapter on hypnosis. And I deliberately talk about the negative aspects of hypnosis. You know, who wants to thought that they're in a trance, that they're under someone else's control? But then when we examine the way our ordinary consciousness is constructed, it's a much more thorough, slavish state of consciousness than hypnosis, actually. For instance, an ordinary hypnotist can't beat you if you don't do what he suggests. But our parents and other agents of socialization could physically beat us when we didn't act as they wanted us to and think as they wanted us to. Or worse yet, an ordinary hypnotist can't threaten to withhold love if you don't see the world the way he does. But our parents many times threatened to withhold love from us unless we agreed with their point of view about things. So actually, ordinary consciousness is a much more profound state of trance than the hypnotic state. And yes, we do need to wake up from it.
In fact, there has been a suggestion that I find very intriguing. Charles Musez presented a paper to the Anthropological Society saying that really we are hypnotized almost from birth by our culture, by our parents. That's how we learn language. That's how we become socialized, is in effect through hypnosis.
Yes. You know, the strange thing is that the Eastern psychologies, Buddhism or Hinduism particularly, have the idea that we live in a state of illusion. They call it samsara or maya. And they don't really mean that the world is illusory, but that we have such distorted perceptions of it that we live in an illusion or a dream of our own creating. Now, the funny thing is that while we don't have this idea in Western psychology, we actually know more about the nuts and bolts of living in illusion than the Easterners do. All our research about the nature of the unconscious, about the way perception is a relatively arbitrary construction, works out the mechanisms of Maya or samsara. It tells us exactly how we live in a dream. I've tried to combine some of these ideas in my Waking Up book because I think we desperately need to know that the state of consciousness we ordinarily walk around in is not some simple, natural, sane state. It's a very arbitrary, very biased, very slanted construction, which is marvelous for some things, but quite terrible for other things. And until you question your ordinary consciousness and realize there are other potentials that you're distorting in your ordinary state, until you question it, there's nothing you can do about it.
Can you give me an example of, for example, for people who are viewing right now in a presumably ordinary state of consciousness, TV watching, what might be some of the inherent dangers there?
Well, we'll skip the question of whether TV consciousness is an ordinary state of consciousness or not.
It's common, let's put it that way.
It's common, yes, it's certainly common. Let's take an interesting example. We all believe that we have will, that we can carry out our decisions. Well, that's true occasionally, but how many times did each of us have some very important emotional revelation or insight about the way we were living our life and decide deeply in our heart of hearts that we were going to change? And one day later, if that long, we forgot about it. Why can't we even remember our emotional knowledge, our emotional insights, much less have the will to carry it out? That's the kind of question people have to ask themselves. And it's the kind of ability we can develop if we work at it. But ordinary life, ordinary education will not help us do that.
Well, you know, in one of your earlier books, States of Consciousness, you describe consciousness as a system that tends to maintain its own integrity, its own homeostasis or stability. And if new information were to come in that would throw that system off, it might tend to reject that information, wouldn't you say?
That's right. And we know a great deal in Western psychology about the mechanisms for doing that. We have repression as the most extreme example, where you totally block your perception or memory of something. We have distortions of perception where you see it in a less threatening manner. You throw away some of the reality of it in order to see just the part that doesn't bother you. Or we have sublimation, where somehow you take the energy of impulses you can't deal with and change that energy into something else. We know a great deal about the specific mechanisms of living in a dream, as it were.
So what you're suggesting, if I understand you correctly, Charlie, is that our very best insights, the things that we really want to go with, we distort using these very mechanisms.
We've been told to distort them. For example, how many of us really pay attention to our nighttime dreams? Very few, because we were taught over and over again as children, not just by our parents but by society, dreams are unimportant, dreams are silly, dreams are meaningless. Well, look, if you think of it in terms of the amount of time we spend sleeping and dreaming, there goes about 10% of what could be life experience totally devalued. So most people don't even remember their dreams anymore.
There's an old phrase in the Talmud that a dream uninterpreted is like a letter unopened. I think I might have a huge stack of unopened mail there.
Yes. But even more important than recalling our dreams is waking up from the dream of everyday life. And it's a funny thing. It's very hard to convince people that they're in a dream.
Yeah.
Until you begin really working on it yourself, nothing happens. I can remember the first time I read a book about Gurdjieff's ideas, and I intellectually read it and was convinced, yes, I'm asleep, but there's this little mental effort I can make to wake up. And so I partially woke up. And it was perfectly obvious that this was a superior state of consciousness. And 3 months later, I remembered that after 5 seconds of that, I totally forgot about it, slipped back into ordinary consciousness, didn't even think about it.
Now, what you're saying here is if you say to yourself, yes, this is a dream, but I can wake up, that does something.
Yes. Not just saying it, but there are specific sorts of things to do. An analogy is helpful here. Again, let's think about nighttime dreams. By the standards of waking consciousness, a lot of our nighttime dreams are dumb. To use a fancy psychological technical term, they're dumb. You don't remember things you ought to remember in a dream to make things better. You don't seem to be able to do things. You get confused. You're deluded by things that would never delude you. So when you wake up, you think, my consciousness is so much clearer now than in my dreams.
Right, I mean, like all those letters would seem to me like junk mail.
Yes, a lot of them do seem like junk mail. Okay, not that there's nothing useful in dream interpretation, but I'm just using this as an analogy, okay? In a similar way, there is a way of becoming more aware of oneself, of becoming conscious of being consciousness, that constitutes the kind of waking up that Gurdjieff talked about. And in comparison, then you realize your ordinary consciousness is dreamlike.
Consciousness of being conscious?
Yes, consciousness of consciousness.
Consciousness of consciousness. It almost sounds like some sort of infinite feedback loop.
Well, you can think about it logically that way, but it doesn't work that way practically. How does it work? You can only understand how it works if you do it.
Okay. Can we do it now? I mean, is it something
you
that
can
be
work
done?
on it? Certainly, you can try it.
Right now?
Right this minute. Okay, you can become aware of being aware. You can sort of create an extra space in your mind so that instead of being totally identified with the words you're speaking and the thoughts pushing behind those words, you can say, feel your body, notice the space around you at the same time that you're perceiving what's happening or speaking and the like. You can create a certain kind of space. And sometimes just this much instruction will give people a certain feeling for it. Other times this isn't enough, you have to do more to it, but you can begin to see a little bit of waking up, a little more clarity and so forth, and it can develop.
Now, it seems to me, almost just listening to you and trying to follow or track your thought, very philosophically stimulating. Like I had this image just now of you and I as sort of actors in a stage. something like that. Am I in the right direction here?
It's more than acting. The problem is we're always acting, but we're identified with our role. You're being Jeffrey Mishlove, and you're identified with being Jeffrey Mishlove. There's a perspective, a more awake perspective, in which you can act Jeffrey Mishlove, but you're not identified with it.
That's the sense I had.
Yes. Yes, there's more to you than that. This is just a momentary manifestation.
Like the actor was just one facet, and then all of these other facets, I had glimmerings of them, just as you were speaking there.
And of course, once you begin to get this wider perspective that comes from practicing waking up, a lot of options appear that weren't there. I mean, everyone in the audience can think of instances where they made a fool of themselves in some situation, and in retrospect, when they're out of the heat of it, they realized, I didn't have to say that thing I did. I didn't have to be so incensed at what they said. That's really not that important to me, but somehow I lost myself. Well, you can find yourself, you can remember yourself, as Gurdjieff put it, and wake up again.
Sense I had is almost like instead of being the actor, I could become the playwright.
Yes, it's a very good analogy.
And this is what you cover in your book.
Yes, this is what it's about.
So now I've been enlightened to the extent that I discover I can be the playwright of my own life. Where do we go from there?
You have to practice it to make it happen for more than a second or two at a time.
Right, or 3 months later I'll have forgotten all about it.
Or 3 seconds later you'll have forgotten all about it. Really, you know, I was embarrassed so many times at discovering the trick of doing this and doing it for a second or two and forgetting all about it. I can get up and lecture people on how to do this and forget to do it. One of the things you learn through the kind of self-observation that I talk about in the book is the degree to which almost everything in your mind and heart can go on automatic. Your perceptions can be all automatic, your thoughts can run on automatic, your feelings can be, and it's sort of like there's nobody home. The machinery just runs itself.
And that's how, I suppose, we get locked into all of these social patterns, wars, pollution. A lot of that is a result of this automatic behavior, I would think. I mean, people wouldn't consciously do these things.
You know, I have tried to stop using the word normal consciousness or ordinary consciousness because it implies that somehow the state most people are in is just natural. I think a more accurate term for it that I'm using now is consensus consciousness. The consciousness inside you has been shaped to reflect the consensus of the society you were raised in, the particular people who influence you. So you carry society around in your own mind. And part of what has happened in that is you've been told to believe that it's natural. It's really quite arbitrary, but it's not
it seems
natural.
ironic to me because if we look at other cultures, or even our own culture in the past, if we were to go back, say, 500 years to Renaissance times and question people about their reality, we would think that they were deluded. They believed the earth was flat. They had these remarkable delusions, and yet I suspect that we have comparable delusions of our own.
They even thought that the seat of consciousness was in the heart. Of course, we think it's in the head. Why do we think it's in? Do we feel it there? A lot of us even feel it there because we've been told over and over again that that's where it is.
Well, you know, in your book, Transpersonal Psychologies, you have a remarkable essay on the assumptions of Western psychology, and you list about 20, I think, things that we all take for granted as part of our reality, and then you suggest an alternative view to every one of them. This is the sort of thing you're talking about, I guess, when we say waking up.
Writing that chapter was an incredibly interesting experience, actually. The Transpersonal Psychologies book is primarily a collection of essays by people in various spiritual disciplines like Sufism or yoga or something like that, and I asked them to write about their spiritual system as a psychology. And then I had to edit all this. And I would be editing someone's chapter, and I'd find myself thinking, come on, how can they do that? What do they mean by that? And I keep getting thrown back, now wait a minute, this is an intelligent person, they get along well in the world, they have lots of people who believe like that, and part of me is saying, how can they be so nonsensical? Maybe that means I ought to examine my assumptions about the way things are that makes me run up against these, and that's what inspired me to write that chapter. Having all these different ways of looking at the world in front of me in such an intense way made me realize I take a lot of things for granted, we all do, and I never verified them. I never decided I would see the world this way. It was just drummed into me as part of being a Westerner, and I'm not sure they're true.
But it seems in principle we have this, I guess what they sometimes call left brain functioning of the mind, we call logic or rationality, but if you analyze it, every logical system is based on assumptions that are themselves unquestioned or unproven.
Being logical simply means somebody made up a set of assumptions out of the air and a set of rules to work with them, and you're following the rules. It tells you nothing about the truth of your assumptions.
And so often when we think we're being logical, we're absolutely certain there could be no other way to do it but that.
Now here's where self-study is very important because, for example, one of the assumptions that a lot of people have drummed deep into their psyches and sometimes right up in consciousness is that basically I'm no good. There's something wrong with me, I'm not good enough, and so forth. And people's lives pivot around these implicit assumptions. They start interpreting the world that way, right? Oh, I failed again, right? Well, that proves that I'm no good, so forth. How did you make that assumption?
Well, self-esteem is an issue, surely, that must go back to childhood and parental conditioning, or something at least as deep as that.
Oh, yes. A lot of it is conditioning. You know, we think, oh, conditioning, that's something Pavlov did with his dogs. He rang the bell and presented a little food, and they salivated, and pretty soon just ringing the bell would make them salivate. It applies just as much to human beings. We've been conditioned in a lot of ways, and we don't know it anymore. It just seems like the natural way our mind works.
Well, Charlie, recently in the whole field of transpersonal psychology, there's an emphasis, say through such materials as the Course in Miracles, that all of our negative thoughts, all of our guilt, all of our anger, all of our pain is all absolutely 100% illusion. What do you think of that?
I think it's a fascinating idea that I regard as dangerous. Say, for instance, take The Course in Miracles, a book that just bothers me no end every time I read it. The basic premise, I think, is true, that sort of as you think, so shall ye be. But as a psychologist, I also know that thinking is only part of the show up here. There's a lot of unconscious processes going on, and you can get at some of those through thinking, but some of them you need special techniques to get at. You need somebody playing the role of a facilitator or a therapist who pushes on you in funny ways that make certain things come up. Or you need special self-observational techniques and the like. And I think it's important to get at those. That's another one of the themes that's become of more and more interest to me. I think our great discovery in psychology in the West has been the unconscious mind. And you know, they don't seem to know that in the East. The spiritual systems there tend to focus exclusively on the conscious mind and getting it into altered and higher states of consciousness without much recognition of how the unconscious can come in and screw up the things you're doing, pervert them to different sorts of ends. When we can combine that knowledge of the West about the unconscious with the goals of enlightenment that we have in the East, we will really have a comprehensive psychology.
And do you feel that you're close to that end yourself?
Oh, no. I'm moving a little ways along that way, but no way close at all.
You know, a lot of people purport they have the technique. You use their method, you can program your subconscious mind using conscious techniques of one sort or another, and you tend to feel they're reaching too far.
Well, I also have a lot of reservations about programming your unconscious, because that's not asking the questions, why is your unconscious mind that way? It's like, you know, I know how to use a wrench and a screwdriver. I don't know much about cars, but you want me to tune up your engine? I can tighten some things here and loosen some things there and take some excess parts off. That's the feeling I get sometimes with these people who have powerful techniques like hypnosis, who just want to sort of jump in and change your unconscious mind around. I'm more for self-observation along the lines Gurdjieff used and therapeutic sorts of exploration, so you find out precisely what's there first before you jump in and make major changes. I think it works better that way.
And you are also developing a seminar program, don't you? Have one?
I do seminars occasionally dealing with this whole question of waking up. I had an ongoing group for a while that I was experimenting, applying some of these techniques with, but I'm not doing that currently.
I see. But the whole point of the discipline that basically you recommend is this self-observation.
Self-observation and waking up. The two go together.
Well, now what's the difference?
Okay. You can observe yourself without making the little shift that makes your consciousness get into this broader perspective. You know, you can say, every time I touch a doorknob, I'll take a note on what the feelings in my right elbow were, to make up a silly example. And you might learn something, but you're not necessarily more awake by that, although it will help in the long run. But the self-remembering, the waking up aspect of it, and I can't really describe this in words because you have to experience it. It's not definable in words. Adds a certain extra dimension of perspective, of width, of freedom beyond that.
You can't define it in words.
I can give an analogy again. We've all had days where in retrospect we say, wow, I was really out of it. I didn't pay attention and I said stupid things and I didn't know what I was doing. And those are pretty unawake by comparison with our normal state. Okay, with the techniques of waking up that can be practiced, the ordinary state looks like that. How could you go around being so stupid?
And you've been studying Gurdjieff, practicing these disciplines for a long time now, some 20 years or so, haven't you?
Yes, I've been doing a variety of things. My internal laboratory work, as it were.
You're also practicing Aikido as another example of a mind-body discipline that seems to go along these lines. And I didn't mention for our viewers, you're a professor of psychology at the
Yes.
University of California.
My respectable side.
You have credentials. What can you say? I know it's difficult to talk about oneself in this fashion, but after practicing these techniques for 20 years, what if a person who were viewing were to be serious about this, what do you think they might be able to get based on your own experience?
I'm glad you asked an easy question. I don't think there's a simple answer for that. I think each of us has an individual path. I think self-knowledge will help on any path. Being able to wake up more will help on any sort of path. But there are specialties that I wouldn't prescribe for people. I'll tell you what I'd like to do. What I'd like to have as a result of some big research project is the Consumers Union report on paths to enlightenment. Where they would be able to say, we studied 20 paths with 400 people in each for 20 years, and as a result, we should say that if you have a certain type of personality, don't do Zen. Zen never works for your type, but Sufi dancing is really where it's at. And for another type, tarot readings are the thing. I'd love us to have that kind of thing. And we could develop it scientifically if we had a mind to it. Socially, we don't, of course.
I have a feeling that our culture is sort of moving in that direction where we have so much and it's become such a consumer ballpark in a way that we'll begin to see this type of, the same way we would have advice on buying pizzas or automobiles.
Yes, but I'd like to see it happen from a scientific perspective, from some relatively objective people looking at what really happens. Of course, we can't wait for that. I mean, we're alive now. We want to improve the quality of our lives and learn to love and serve and so forth now. So people have to take a chance. For instance, one of the funny things I end up concluding in this Waking Up book is that even though I have immense respect for Gurdjieff's teachings, I'm not sure whether I recommend a Gurdjieff-type group for anyone. It might work well for some people, it might not. People have to find their own path with heart and experiment with it and set up some safeguards so they don't get too crazy on it.
Charley, we've got about a minute left, and I'm wondering if we can wrap all of this up for people who have been really listening, really interested in wanting to pursue some of this further. You have a newsletter called The Open Mind.
Yes.
That might be available to people.
Yes, people can write me at the Department of Psychology at UC Davis, California, and I'll send them information about the newsletter. It's sort of future chapters of books I'm going to write dealing with parapsychology, with spirituality and science, human potentials, that sort of thing.
And if they don't want the newsletter, but they want to remember everything that you said just now, what could you say to them?
They can start right now. You can wake up this very moment and try to be aware of being aware. Don't try to force anything in particular, but just start observing yourself. Start being yourself and standing beside yourself simultaneously, as it were, as a metaphor, and studying yourself. After all, you're the most fascinating person in the world.
That's a wonderful note to end the program on. Charley, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you with me on the program.
Book 2 in the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book series is a tribute to parapsychologist Russell Targ, celebrating his 90th birthday. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.